In the golden haze of their early 20s, two young women walked through life like sisters. Clara and Jean, different in every way, yet bound by something deeper than blood. Clara was the strong one, disciplined, respected, the kind of woman people turned to when life felt uncertain. Jean, on the other hand, was the light, joyful, radiant, and full of laughter that could melt even the hardest heart. Together, they were inseparable. They shared dreams, secrets, and promises whispered in the quiet of night. To everyone around them, theirs was the kind of friendship that could never break. But life has a way of testing the bonds we hold dearest. What began in love soon turned to envy, and the sisterhood that once shone so bright began to crack under the weight of jealousy. This is their story, a story of betrayal, of loss, of pain, but also of redemption, forgiveness, and the beauty of second chances. Because sometimes the ones we trust the most are the ones who break us, and the ones we meet when we've lost everything are the ones sent to heal us. The story of Clara and Jean began in the golden haze of their early 20s, when everything in life seemed possible and every day carried the promise of laughter, friendship, and a shared future. Clara, at 25, was the kind of woman people respected more for her presence than her beauty. She carried herself with an air of discipline and control that made others see her as dependable, almost like a big sister figure to everyone in their circle. Jean, a year younger, was her opposite in nearly every way. Where Clara was reserved and careful with her words, Jean was vivacious, spontaneous, and lit up every room she entered with a beauty that was effortless. Her laughter was like music, her skin glowed with youth, and her smile drew people in even before she spoke. Yet, beneath the joy she radiated, Jean bore the heavy weight of loneliness. She had no family, no parents to call home to, and no siblings to run to in times of need. Clara, seeing this, had opened her home to Jean, insisting that her house was Jean's house, and from that decision a bond was formed that many envied. Together they walked through the streets of Lagos hand in hand, to two young women who seemed inseparable, two sisters not bound by blood but by choice. They shared meals, clothes, secrets whispered in the stillness of night, and dreams about the men they might one day love. To everyone who saw them, theirs was the kind of friendship that could never be broken. But, as often happens when two different worlds try to live under one roof, cracks began to appear, thin at first like hairlines on glass, until jealousy began to seep in like water finding its way through stone. At first, Clara admired Jean's beauty with the pride of a sister, even helping her braid her hair in styles that made her glow even more, dressing her up before outings, and insisting that Jean deserved to shine. But as the days passed, admiration slowly turned into envy, the kind of envy that creeps into the heart silently and poisons even the sweetest of intentions. Neighbors began to notice Jean whenever they passed, commenting on her figure, her poise, and her natural charm. Men who once greeted Clara with polite respect now lingered longer in their conversations with Jean, their eyes betraying a fascination that Clara could not ignore. Even in the marketplace, it was Jean's laughter that drew sellers to lower prices, Jean's beauty that earned free extras, Jean's smile that made strangers generous. Clara, though she never voiced her feelings, began to carry a quiet bitterness inside her chest, a burning question she could not shake. Why did everyone seem to prefer Jean? She was the one with a house, the one with stability, the one offering shelter, yet Jean was the one who captured hearts effortlessly. And so Clara started to pull back ever so slightly, her warmth cooling into politeness, her smile shrinking into thin lines, her words measured and laced with an edge of irritation. Jean noticed, of course she did, but she brushed it aside with the naivety of someone who believed love and friendship could overcome anything. But the tension only grew stronger. The little things Clara once overlooked now seemed to sting. When Jean borrowed her dress and received compliments from half the street, Clara's heart tightened. When Jean's suitors knocked at the door asking after her, Clara's eyes darkened with a storm she did not voice. Even the simple fact that people began to say Clara is lucky to have Jean by her side began to feel like an insult, as though Clara was the lesser one, standing in the shadow of the girl she had once taken in out of pity. Resentment is a slow poison, and in Clara's heart it spread until even the sound of Jean's laughter became unbearable. Where once she saw Jean as a sister, she now saw her as competition, an intruder in her own home, someone who was robbing her of the attention and respect she felt she deserved. Yet, instead of speaking, Clara kept silent, watching, calculating, waiting for the moment when she could turn the tide. And that moment came suddenly, without warning, one hot afternoon when the air was thick and heavy, and the entire neighborhood seemed to be watching from behind curtains and half-closed doors. It began innocently, with Jean returning home later than usual, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face still glowing from laughter shared with friends at the market. Clara was waiting. Her eyes, sharp and burning with suppressed rage, followed Jean as she walked in casually, dropping her bag on the chair like it was any other day. But this was not any other day. Clara's silence cracked like thunder as she exploded into accusations, harsh, biting words that cut deeper than any blade. She called Jean ungrateful, shameless, accused her of turning her own house into a stage to steal attention and pride away from her. Jean stood frozen, confusion etched on her face, stammering as she tried to explain, but Clara would hear none of it. With a fury that shocked even herself, Clara dragged Jean's clothes out of the wardrobe, flung them into the dust outside, and locked the gate with finality. The neighbors gathered quickly, their whispers sharp as knives. So this is what friendship has turned into? Jean's pleas, her trembling voice begging Clara to listen, to have mercy, fell on deaf ears. The woman who had once called her sister now looked at her with eyes colder than stone. And as Jean stood outside, humiliated, abandoned, and betrayed, the golden days of their friendship came to a brutal end, leaving her stranded before the watching eyes of a neighborhood that loved gossip more than compassion. Little did Jean know, this betrayal was only the beginning of a journey that would test every fiber of her being, a storm that would change her life forever. The street was alive with whispers that afternoon, a small crowd of neighbors peering through windows and over compound fences as Jean stood outside Clara's gate, her clothes scattered in the dust like trash. Clara's voice, sharp as a blade, cut through the humid air as she hurled insults that bruised Jean's heart more than the humiliation itself. "Ungrateful girl, I fed you, clothed you, and this is how you repay me," she shouted, her words dripping with venom. Jean's eyes welled with tears as she clutched at the gate, begging, "Please, Clara, you are my sister. Where do you want me to go?" But Clara's heart had already turned to stone. She twisted the key in the lock, shutting Jean out forever. The neighbors exchanged knowing glances, their whispers heavy with judgment and gossip. So this is how their friendship ends. Best friends can never be trusted. Jean wanted the earth to open up and swallow her. She had no father to run to, no mother's arms to cry in, no family anywhere who would take her in. The very home that had once given her warmth had turned into a place of rejection, and she was left standing in the open, the whole street watching her downfall as though it were a play performed for their entertainment. As evening fell, Jean gathered the scattered pieces of her belongings with trembling hands. Every item felt heavier than it should have, weighed down not by its size, but by the shame attached to it. She tried knocking on the doors of neighbors she thought might have pity, but they all shook their heads. We cannot put ourselves in the middle of this matter," one woman whispered before shutting her door. Another neighbor offered only a cold stare, then pulled her children inside as if Jean's misfortune were contagious. Hungry, exhausted, and with nowhere to go, Jean wandered the streets until she found an abandoned shop near the edge of the main road. The windows were broken and the floor was littered with dust, but it was the only roof she could find. She huddled in the corner, hugging herself as the night grew cold, her stomach empty and her heart shattered. Tears rolled down her face as she whispered to herself, "So this is what friendship has given me? Is this the reward for loving someone like a sister?" The city lights in the distance seemed to mock her, glowing brightly while her world had turned into darkness. It was in that abandoned shop, in the depths of her despair, that Jean's fate shifted. On the third morning, as she sat weakly on the step outside, her clothes rumpled and her hair undone, a tall young man stopped in front of her. His name was George, 29. His skin sun-kissed from long days working under the Lagos sun, his frame lean and strong from the roughness of life. He had the tired look of someone who had faced his own share of disappointments, yet there was a kindness in his eyes that set him apart from the rest of the world. George was a bus conductor, though not the rough, loud kind one would expect. He had been educated, had dreams of wearing suits and working in an office, but life had been unkind, pushing him into the crowded chaos of yellow buses and screaming passengers. When he saw Jean sitting there, he slowed his steps. Something about the sadness in her eyes tugged at his soul. "Sister, are you all right?" he asked gently. Jean tried to hide her tears, but her voice betrayed her brokenness as she replied, "I have nowhere to go." George studied her for a moment, his mind racing with questions, but his heart gave him the answer before his thoughts could. Without hesitation, he pulled out the small loaf of bread he had bought for his own lunch and placed it in her hands. Jean stared at him, surprised by the simple act of kindness after so much rejection. She wanted to refuse, out of pride, but her hunger betrayed her, and she ate as tears streamed down her face. George sat beside her, not pressing for details, just offering quiet company as the city roared around them. After a long silence, Jean told him her story, haltingly at first, then with the flood of someone who had carried pain too long. George listened without judgment, the nodding slowly as though each word was something precious. And when she finished, he looked at her and said simply, "Don't worry. From today, you are not alone." It was in that moment, on a dusty roadside outside an abandoned shop, that Jean's story began to change. She did not know it yet, but destiny had placed in her path the man who would carry her through the storms of life. And as George helped her to her feet, the whispers of a new chapter began, one that would be written in love, sacrifice, and resilience. Lagos was not kind to the broken, and Jean quickly learned that the city had little mercy for those without a place to call home. Days bled into nights as she roamed the streets, clutching her few belongings in a tattered bag, her stomach groaning with hunger that seemed to grow louder than her own thoughts. Sometimes she begged, her voice trembling as she stretched out her hand to strangers, only to be ignored or mocked. On other days, she went without food entirely, her body growing weaker, her once radiant skin dulling under the strain of exhaustion. When illness came, she shivered under the harsh night winds, wrapping herself in scraps of cloth to survive. Lagos, with its endless honking, blaring music, and chaotic crowds, became both a prison and a battlefield for Jean, and she was fighting alone until George appeared like a light in her darkness. He did not come with promises he could not keep, but with simple acts of kindness. Half his lunch shared, a bottle of water pressed into her hands, a listening ear when her soul threatened to collapse under the weight of despair. George's own life was no bed of roses. By day, he worked as a bus conductor, his voice hoarse from shouting for passengers at the top of his lungs, his hands calloused from gripping steel bars as the Danfo buses rattled down crowded roads. Yet beneath the grime and sweat, George carried himself with quiet dignity. He had gone to school, studied with dreams of becoming something greater. But like so many young men, the harsh reality of unemployment had dragged him into the streets. Where others saw shame in his job, George saw survival, and he embraced it with humility. Each night, after long hours of work, he returned to the small single room he rented in a noisy compound, collapsing onto his thin mattress with nothing but determination to keep going. When he met Jean and heard her story, something inside him shifted. He recognized the loneliness in her eyes, the same loneliness he had carried in his own chest for years. And though he had little, he offered her what he could, his companionship, his laughter in the middle of suffering, his steady presence when the world had turned its back on her. It did not take long before George made a decision that would change Jean's life, that he asked her to move into his small room with him. It was not much, barely enough space for one person, with walls that bore the scars of time and a single mattress laid on the floor. But to Jean, it felt like a palace compared to the abandoned shop. She hesitated at first, ashamed of being a burden, but George insisted, his voice firm yet kind. "You cannot keep sleeping on the streets. As small as my room is, we can manage together." And so, Jean packed her few belongings and followed him into the little space he called home. They adjusted to each other's routines quickly. Jean swept and cleaned the room daily, cooked simple meals with what George brought home, and slowly began to breathe again. George, in turn, found comfort in coming back after long, exhausting days to see her waiting with a smile, her presence making the small room feel warmer than it had ever been. Together, they painted pictures of a future that seemed impossible given their present circumstances, yet their words made it feel almost real. The city was still cruel, the hunger was still real, but somehow, the burden grew lighter when shared between them. George's kindness became her anchor, and Jean's resilience became his inspiration. And then, one quiet evening, as the two of them sat by the roadside sharing roasted corn, Jean looked up at George and saw not just a friend, but a man whose soul shone brighter than his hardships. His laughter rang in her ears like music. His eyes glowed with sincerity, and for the first time since her betrayal, her heart stirred with something she had long forgotten love. George, too, found himself drawn to her strength, her beauty that not even suffering could dim, her spirit that refused to break despite everything. In that fleeting glance between them, time seemed to pause, the noisy Lagos traffic fading into the background. The world had pushed them both into corners of despair, but somehow, in each other, they found a reason to keep fighting. And in that moment, as Jean's gaze lingered on George's, the truth became undeniable. It was love at first glance. Life in George's little room was far from comfortable, yet it became the foundation of a love story built on patience, endurance, and faith. Every day, George woke before dawn, his body aching from the strain of long hours spent hanging from the side of yellow buses. He shouted himself hoarse calling for passengers, squeezed into the chaos of Lagos traffic, and endured insults from angry commuters, all while fighting the fatigue of sleepless nights. But through it all, his heart remained steady, because every time he returned home and saw Jean waiting with a warm smile, the weight of his suffering grew lighter. He began to save, little by little, cutting corners where he could, sometimes going without meals just to tuck a few crumpled naira notes under his mattress. His goal was not for himself alone, but for them. George believed Jean's gift with fashion could be her doorway to a new life, and he resolved to do whatever it took to make that happen. Jean, for her part, refused to be a passive receiver of George's sacrifices. She kept their tiny space spotless, cooking with the little he brought home, patching his worn clothes, and encouraging him when his shoulders sagged with exhaustion. When George finally gathered enough money to enroll her in a tailoring and fashion school, Jean wept tears of gratitude, clutching his hands as though he had given her the world. The days that followed were not easy. George stretched himself thin, working extra shifts, sometimes returning home so tired that he fell asleep on the bare floor. Jean, meanwhile, poured herself into her training, her fingers raw from hours of sewing, her mind buzzing with designs and fabrics. At night, they would sit together in the glow of a kerosene lamp, Jean showing George the stitches she had learned that day, while George encouraged her with stories of how their future would be brighter. Together, they prayed simple, heartfelt prayers whispered in the darkness, asking God to turn their suffering into testimony. Slowly, their sacrifices began to bear fruit. Jean's teachers at the fashion school recognized her natural talent, praising her neat stitches and eye for style. She began to stand out among her peers, and though she often returned home weary and hungry, the fire in her spirit only grew stronger. George, too, started to see the results of his determination. After years of saving and planning, he managed to buy his own bus, no longer a conductor shouting in the heat, but an owner who employed others. The change did not happen overnight, but piece by piece, their lives began to shift. They celebrated small wins, Jean sewing her first full dress, George handing her the key to his bus with a proud grin. These little victories, though humble, felt monumental, and they became stepping stones toward the future they dreamed about during their nights of hunger and tears. And so, with each passing day, their bond deepened. They were no longer just two broken souls clinging to each other for survival, but partners building something greater than themselves. Jean graduated from fashion school with distinction, her confidence blooming as she began taking small clients on the side. George expanded his work, using the profits from his bus to begin building a logistics company, determined to rise above the life that had once humbled him. Together, they carried one another through every setback, celebrating every milestone with laughter, prayer, and unwavering faith. Years rolled by, and the seeds of sacrifice that George and Jean had planted began to blossom into a life more beautiful than either of them had dared to imagine. Jean's talent as a fashion designer quickly spread beyond the small clients she first catered to. Her designs caught the eyes of influential women, celebrities, and eventually international buyers. Within a few years, she had opened her own fashion school, training young women who, like her, had once thought life had closed its doors on them. Her name became synonymous with elegance and resilience, and her brand stood tall as one of the most respected in the fashion world. George, too, climbed the ladder of success. From one bus, he built a fleet. From a fleet, he established one of the largest logistics companies in the city. His offices, filled with employees in smart uniforms, became a symbol of what determination could achieve. Together, Jean and George had built an empire from nothing but sweat, tears, and relentless faith. They were now married, blessed with a son whose laughter filled the halls of their spacious home, a constant reminder of how far they had come from the little room in which their love story began. While Jean and George soared, Clara's life spiraled into chaos. The woman who once stood tall in the neighborhood, proud and sharp-tongued, slowly faded into obscurity. Her beauty, once her weapon, waned with age and hardship. Her money, recklessly spent on fleeting pleasures and false friends, vanished like smoke in the wind. The men who once pursued her for her looks had long abandoned her, leaving her to battle life alone. With no business, no family, and no true friends, Clara found herself in the same street she had once cast Jean into, but with no George waiting to save her. Her clothes grew tattered, her health declined, and whispers of her fall spread through the same neighborhood that once envied her. The neighbors who had once gossiped about Jean now shook their heads at Clara, muttering about karma, about how jealousy and wickedness always returned to consume the heart that carried them. As the years passed, The contrast between Jean's rise and Clara's fall became a story on its own, told in hushed tones across gatherings, in markets, and at Sunday after service gists. Jean and George would arrive at events as a power couple. Jean radiant in her own designs, George confident in his tailored suits, their success undeniable. Cameras flashed, journalists clamored for interviews, and people spoke of them as an inspiration, proof that love, hard work, and faith could conquer even the harshest storms. Meanwhile, Clara lurked in shadows, too ashamed to face those she once knew. She coughed violently on street corners, stretched out trembling hands for food, and slept on cold pavements. Her pride had been stripped away, leaving behind only regret. Every time she heard Jean's name, bitterness gnawed at her, but so did shame. The world she had tried to deny Jean had now become the world that denied her. It was in this state of ruin that Clara finally broke. One evening, weakened by hunger and sickness, she dragged herself toward Jean's fashion school, her legs trembling under her weight. The security guards hesitated at first, unable to recognize the frail figure before them, until she lifted her face, and there it was, the shadow of Clara, the woman who had once betrayed Jean. She begged to be let in, her voice cracked and desperate. "Please, I need to see her." Inside, Jean stood tall in her office, surrounded by fabrics, designs, and students she mentored, her life now a stark contrast to the friend who had once thrown her to the streets. And as the door opened to reveal Clara's broken figure, the entire room froze, knowing that the past had finally come back to face its reckoning. The room fell silent as Clara staggered inside, her once glorious figure now reduced to skin and bones, her eyes hollow from years of suffering. For a moment, Jan could barely breathe. Memories flooded back, memories of laughter, of secrets shared, of a friend she had once called sister, and of the cruel betrayal that had thrown her into the streets. Clara collapsed at Jean's feet, her frail body trembling as she sobbed uncontrollably. "Jean, please, forgive me. I destroyed the best friendship I ever had. I let jealousy consume me, and it has left me with nothing." Her voice cracked like glass, her words carrying the weight of a broken spirit. The students in the room, wide-eyed, shifted uncomfortably as they watched the dramatic reunion. To them, Jean was a queen, strong and untouchable. But here lay the woman who had once crushed her, now begging like a child before her. Jean's chest tightened as tears welled in her eyes. She knelt slowly, placing a hand on Clara's shoulder, feeling the fragility of the woman who had once stood tall in pride. "Clara," she whispered, her voice trembling, "you hurt me in ways I never thought I could heal from. You left me to die in the streets, but God lifted me. And because he forgave me when I did not deserve it, I cannot hold you in chains of bitterness." Jean's words cracked as she spoke, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. She pulled Clara into an embrace, and for the first time in years, Clara wept in the arms of the friend she had betrayed. It was not a warm embrace of restored sisterhood, but a cleansing one, a release of years of pain, anger, and resentment. The room, filled with witnesses, went quiet except for the sound of their sobs, a scene that spoke louder than any sermon could. When George arrived moments later and saw Clara kneeling before Jean, his heart swelled with conflicting emotions. He had every reason to despise this woman, every reason to cast her out as she had once cast Jean. But he had also witnessed firsthand the power of forgiveness, the grace that had carried him and Jean from nothing to everything. "Jean," he said softly, "you've done the right thing. Forgiveness doesn't mean she belongs in our lives again, but it means we are free. We are free from the chains of her betrayal." Jean nodded, wiping her tears, and turned to Clara. "I forgive you, Clara. Truly I do. But I cannot bring you close to my family again. The trust we once shared is gone, and some wounds never return to what they were. I pray for your healing, for your peace, but from a distance." Her words were firm yet kind, like a balm and a boundary all at once. Clara's sobs softened into quiet whimpers as she nodded, understanding the depth of what Jean had given her. It wasn't a restoration of friendship, but it was mercy she had not earned, yet desperately needed. As Jean helped her to her feet, the students and staff present that day carried home a story they would never forget, that jealousy and envy destroy, but love and forgiveness endure. Clara walked away, frail but lighter than she had been in years, her soul unburdened by the chains of guilt. And Jean, watching her disappear into the streets once more, whispered a final prayer. "Lord, thank you for lifting me from betrayal to blessing. May my life always be proof that love is stronger than hate." In the end, Jean's story became more than a tale of betrayal. It became a testimony of grace. She rose from the dust that was meant to bury her, turned pain into purpose, and proved that no wound is too deep for God to heal. And Clara, learned that envy destroys faster than poverty ever could. Her fall was her lesson, but Jean's forgiveness was her redemption. Life has a way of humbling the proud and lifting the broken, and in their story, we are reminded that love, forgiveness, and faith are stronger than hate. If this story touched your heart, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to give you a shout out in my next story because every one of you is part of this journey.